I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all its wondrous deeds that I will do in its midst. From the book of Exodus, chapter 3. As you can see, this episode will be on the call of Moses. We are looking at several great characters, patriarchs from the Old Testament within the context of making great saints. We've just seen how God called Abram. He was basically a very insignificant person, but God chose him to make the point that God does everything perfectly. And so, even in our human eyes, we might think God's choice is not the best. God knows best. Secondly, God also is making the point that He deliberately almost will choose someone who is not ready for the task, for the mission that He is going to give this person, to make the point that through His help, his encouragement, they will be transformed and they will experience a power to accomplish God's mission. So today we are looking at the call of Moses. And in chapter 1 of Exodus, we see a profound transition that now has taken place between the book of Genesis and Exodus. So, toward the end of the book of Genesis, there is a famine in the land of Canaan. And so Jacob tells his 11 sons to go to Egypt to buy food because uh, their fields were not doing a good job in their harvests. So they go to Egypt, and through a series of circumstances, some very challenging, some very painful, they meet with their brother Joseph, whom they had sold in slavery. As God does it, there is a wonderful coming together of this family. Joseph forgives his brothers, and now he is the governor of Egypt because he is held in high favor by the Pharaoh. At this point, then, Joseph invites his sons and his father to come and settle in Egypt. So that's exactly what they do. And so now they are prospering, doing very well in the land of Egypt. There's a Pharaoh who comes along and he has not heard about Joseph's exploits for his country. He's a very harsh ruler and feels endangered by the Hebrews who have multiplied in great numbers. And so he decides to enslave them. And so now they are in slavery for over 300 years. And he comes out with an edict that if any male child is born, that male child should be slaughtered. Only female children were allowed to continue living. So, toward the end of the 4th century of slavery, Moses then is born to a Levite family. And the mother decides uh, to disobey Pharaoh, knowing very well that she's putting her life and her little boy's life in danger, but nevertheless, she decides to hide him. But she can't hide him for too long. So then she comes up with this plan to hide Moses in the reeds of the river Nile. And his older sister, Miriam, is guarding this little basket in which her little baby boy brother is sleeping. Then the Pharaoh's daughter comes there for to bathe in the Nile, and she discovers this little basket. And to her astonishment, there is this little boy. Now, as God would have it, Pharaoh should have disregarded his daughter's love for this little baby boy and had it have it slaughtered. On the other hand, he allows his daughter to adopt Moses. So that's what happens then. Moses lives in the royal house. He is treated very well as one of the family. But clearly, because God is choosing him, he is unhappy. And he realizes that even while he is now living as an Egyptian, but he is essentially a Hebrew, and his heart is breaking every day to see how his own people are enslaved by the Egyptians. One day he's out walking and he notices an Egyptian guard manhandling and treating very severely a Hebrew slave. And so he intervenes, and in the process, he ends up killing the Egyptian guard. The following day, he's once again on his walk, thinking that no one has found out that he has killed this Egyptian guard and buried him. See? And so then he sees two Hebrew slaves quarreling among themselves, and he goes to intervene and asks them to stop doing so. When one of them says, "So, you killed the Egyptian guard, and now are you thinking of killing me as well?" And that is when Moses realizes that his life is in danger and he needs to flee Egypt. And so he does that and becomes a fugitive. And now he's in the land of Midian, which is present day southwest Saudi Arabia. And as happens with God, he then is befriended by Jethro, who is a pagan priest, because Moses had helped his 7 daughters, who were shepherdesses, uh, with giving water to their sheep. So then Moses marries one of Jethro's daughters, Zipporah, and has 2 sons. But he is a stranger in an alien land. And you can see God is putting him through a profound purification and preparing him for his mission. One day, as he is taking care of Jethro's flock by Mount Horeb, which is another name for Mount Sinai, he sees a bush that is burning. And so he's curious. And so he goes close to the bush and he hears this voice: "Take your sandals off because you are on holy ground." And that's when he realizes he is in the presence of God. And God then gives him this mission to go back to Egypt. And you can see now Moses' true character without God's help. He says, "I cannot go back because I'm a fugitive, and if I go back, they will definitely arrest me and kill me." To which God's answer is, "All those people who would have sought you out, they are no longer alive." But this is not enough for Moses. And then Moses keeps saying, "I am a man of few words. I'm not eloquent. I don't have a good mind." And God tells him in no uncertain terms, "You are going to be my messenger. And all the help that you need, I will give you. Your brother Aaron is an excellent spokesman. So I will give him to you to do whatever talking you need to do with Pharaoh." So Moses reluctantly but obediently goes back to Egypt. And you see the transformation now that takes place at the hands of God. The, the Hebrews don't have an army, they don't have political or military might. How is Moses going to convince Pharaoh to let his people leave Egypt at first so that they can worship in the desert? But knowing fully well that this is a permanent exodus, how is he going to convince Pharaoh? And I'm sure he too was wondering about that. He is 80 years old when God asks him to go back to Egypt. And so, through a series of interventions that God told Moses and told Moses' people, these will be wondrous deeds that I will work in the midst of Egypt. As far as Egypt is concerned, they were disasters, they were plagues, uh, they were curses that would decimate them and finally bring them to breaking point, so that Pharaoh, even though after 9 such plagues, or in the eyes of the Hebrews, 9 such wondrous deeds, he would still be reluctant. It would take the 10th plague, the 10th wondrous deed or disaster that would finally convince Pharaoh and the Egyptians to let them go. See? So, in the course of his leadership, there are 3 very, very significant events that take place. The first event, obviously, is the Passover feast, during which God performs the 10th wondrous deed when he slays the firstborn of the Egyptians, both humans as well as animals. And he spares the firstborn of the Hebrews, because now the Hebrews, through this Passover feast, have become his chosen people. And how does the angel of God distinguish between the Egyptians and the Hebrews? Because all of this is being done in the dead of night. When the angel sees that the doorposts and lintels of the Hebrew homes are sprinkled with the blood of the lamb that they ate in a covenant meal to celebrate the Passover, the passing over of the angel, plus their passing over from Egypt toward the promised land, he would know this is a Hebrew family and he would spare them. Whereas if there was no blood sprinkled, they would be the firstborn would be slaughtered. That's a very, very prominent milestone. And then that's followed up almost a year later at Mount Sinai, when God then establishes. Actually, he started establishing his covenant relationship with his chosen people, the Hebrews, the Israelites, with the 10 wondrous deeds, but then highlighted in the Passover feast, and then especially at Mount Sinai when he gives Moses the laws. And in asking his people then to obey these laws, they were becoming his covenant people. And among these laws, obviously, the most prominent are the 10 Commandments. And then this journey through through the desert toward Israel, toward the promised land begins. But we see it could have taken just a few weeks. On the other hand, it takes 40 years. And here is Moses then having to deal with the sinfulness, the wickedness, the rebelliousness among many of the Hebrews who are continually complaining against God, against Moses' leadership, accompanied with Aaron. They're never satisfied. And Moses has to deal with all of this. And the amazing thing is, at one point, when 3,000 Hebrews have rebelled against God, and guess what? They ask Aaron, who aids and abets their decision, to have him create a golden calf out of all the jewelry that they bring to him from the different families. See, he creates a golden calf, and these people, they worship this golden calf and basically are saying that this golden calf is who brought us out of the land of Egypt. So it's absolutely shocking. And here is Moses then acting as intermediary between God and his people. And you can see he is clearly a sign pointing toward Jesus when he says, I'm asking you to erase me, my name, from the book of life, but not to destroy them. Destroy me rather than them. This is exactly what Jesus did. He told his Father, destroy me so that they can live. And God said those 3,000 people will perish, and he spares the rest. But over 40 years, all those who had rebelled against God were not allowed. They perished, they died. They were not allowed to enter the promised land because God is making it very clear. This covenant union that I'm establishing toward you, it's moving you back to paradise, back to the original creation that I made of you as my image and likeness, to move from sin to sinlessness, from this terrible, selfish, self-centered preoccupation with self to a wonderful, pure preoccupation with me, with God, and with all that is good, as well as in service of everybody else. And he's doing this gradually through those 40 years by purging God's people of their sins and their wickedness and their evil and preparing them to enter the promised land. Because the promised land, in a way, is a representation of paradise. And then you have Moses, who now has become a very holy man. He alone has seen God from behind. His face now is glowing with the glory of God, so that when he is in the camp, he has to cover his face. The only time he can show his face is when he goes to meet with God in the makeshift temple. And yet, this very holy man, who was loved deeply by God, who called him his friend, Moses had his flaws. And two flaws are mentioned. One is God's people were complaining bitterly against God, as well as Moses and Aaron and the leadership, because they were dying of thirst. And so they come to Massa and Meribah, where there's a huge rock. And God hears their cry, and he hears Moses' plea on their behalf. And so he says, Moses, strike that rock and you will have water. And we see that Moses strikes the rock twice. So I guess he felt caught between a rock and a hard place. The rock being God, steadfast. One name for God in the Old Testament, especially in the Psalms, is rock. And a hard place are all the complaints and the grumbling of his people. And so there was some hesitation in him. So he struck the rock twice. God did answer his plea, his request. There was plenty of water for everybody to drink and for the animals. But Moses had faltered in his total trust of God. And then, as they come on the outskirts of the promised land, they are in this great Moab plateau. See, uh, that is at the base of Mount Nebo. See, and so God tells Moses, "You can go up Mount Nebo and you can view the promised land, but you will not enter it. One, because you doubted me, and two, because I did not ask you to send spies to reconnoiter the promised land, and you did so against my wishes. Once again, you exhibited some doubt. You gave in to your fear. So you will not enter the promised land, which in my thinking is God's way of saying, Moses, I have a better promised land for you. I'm taking you home." And we know that God took him home because at the transfiguration, Jesus, along with Moses and Elijah, are having this very intimate conversation. And they're talking about Exodus. Clearly, Moses and Elijah are representatives of the first Exodus. And they are seeing how Jesus now, will bring about the fulfillment of that first Exodus through his own Exodus in Jerusalem, where he will die on Calvary and thereby bring about his own passing over. And in doing so, taking us from sin to sinlessness, from sin to righteousness. They are having this conversation, and Moses can see, that God all along had this plan of salvation, and he was using Moses as his instrument. And this holy man was very, very cooperative in the way he obeyed God's commands throughout. And yet, he was not perfect, as no saint is perfect. Saints basically are manifesting God's great love and power in their lives, and they would be the first ones to admit, but for the grace of God, I would never be who I am. See? So then, just before he dies and before they enter the promised land, you have the book of Deuteronomy. And in the book of Deuteronomy, there are three discourses that Moses has with God's people. He's preparing them to enter the promised land, and he's telling them to choose between, you will have to choose between good and evil. For many of these 40 years, you chose evil. And so we went through one trial and tribulation after another. See, now that you're entering the promised land, make sure that you choose good. And later on, Joshua will reinforce this message of Moses. The other message that Moses offers them, which is very interesting, is in the second discourse in Deuteronomy chapter 18, when he says, "One day God will give you a prophet just like me." Clearly, he is referring to Jesus. At the time, he had no idea, because God had not revealed it to him, that this prophet, like him, would indeed be the Son of God, God's very own Son. But I'm sure once he got to heaven, he was very well aware of that. And so he was rejoicing during Jesus' transfiguration, nodding his head and seeing how God, in his wisdom and in his providence, is totally in charge. He knows exactly what He is doing. And even though as humans we will keep worrying, uh, we need to remind ourselves over and over and over, it is not for us to worry, it is for us to trust. And in doing so, we will be very pliable instruments in God's hands. So that is the message that God is giving us through Abraham and now through Moses. And one last point I'll make, and that is there will be times in your life when you will be wondering as you observe the landscape in our country or in the world and wonder, you know, uh, will good ever prevail over evil? Will God ever prevail over Satan and evil? And there will be moments when you probably will feel discouraged and entertain doubts. And in all these stories, God is telling us very gently and yet very firmly, I am God and there is no other. I am God alone. There is no other. I am the unconditioned one. Any other power, especially the powers of evil, they are conditioned, they are creatures, they can never withstand me. So you might not be able to have my view of things, but in trusting me, you have more than you need. God bless you.
Making Great Saints is made possible by Our Ladies Healing Center and God's Embrace Ministries. For more information on Our Ladies Healing Center's healing program, visit ourladieshealingcenter.com. For ongoing formation and daily discipleship through God's Embrace Ministries, visit godsembrace.org.